So welcome everyone to the final episode of the Moving Science podcast series number 1. My name is Vera Zingler and I'm your host today and a neurologist working at the Roche headquarters in Switzerland. I'm joined by Professor Gavin Giovannoni. Many of you know him very well. Gavin is a professor of neurology at Barts and the London School of Medicine at Queen Mary University. Welcome, Gavin.
Thanks for inviting me, Vera. I'm glad to be here.
Great. So I guess we both are wrapping up this incredible journey of podcast series number 1 together. And today we will take some time for reflections on the first series, but we will also have an interesting topic for you. And this is the uncertainty that many people with MS face throughout their lifetimes. And for those of you who stay with us at the very end, we will also reveal the new main theme of the next podcast series that we are starting soon. Now back to you, Gavin. I mean, you have been the host of so many episodes in our first series. I'm just wondering, how is it for you to be on the other side of the microphone today as we are switching roles? And what are your reflections so far on the first podcast series?
No, I don't mind being on the other side. I think we're really on the button in the sense that if you look at what's happening in terms of media, podcasts and particularly long-form podcasts are becoming incredibly popular and influential. And I think it's kind of the way we as a human species process information. So hearing it in audio, rather than having to read it or watch visually. I know this has been recorded to be watched as well, but is enjoyable, and I think people like the long form format as well because it's informal, it's not prepared. People can go off piste and discuss things, and I think that's what's nice about the podcast. And I think that's exactly what we achieved in this first series, is that we were able to discuss things openly with not a fixed agenda, and also discuss the issues that are, I think, driving a change in MS care. We were able to talk about, how do we integrate advanced therapies? How do we target lifestyle factors? How do we incorporate that into the holistic management of MS? Agne from Devon in the UK explained how she sets up her service in the first podcast with her. What I also liked was the artificial intelligence podcasts, how our AI is going to influence how we manage MS and how we monitor it. And so I found that very, very interesting. I think we are just at the tipping point. I don't think the MS community has any idea of how the MS care landscape is going to be transformed by AI at different levels. I like that a lot. And then the urgency. So we had a really good podcast with Laura, Casey, and Amy around how we have to change the paradigm in terms of it. And I like that very much because we got a perspective from different parts of the world as well. And then we'd also discussed lots of innovation. And I suppose the one that's closest to the clinic is the clinical value of neurofilament light chain testing in peripheral blood. And, a lot of practices are already using it. And I suspect it's going to transform our worldview of MS away from being a radiological worldview, just looking at MRI scans essentially, to biochemical. So we're going to start thinking about this disease from a biochemical perspective. And I think that's going to change things as well. So yes, all I can say is the first series has been a very successful series. I've loved the topics. The people who've we had discussions with have been very interesting and engaging, and I hope the MS community listens to them. That's all.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I could not agree more. And by the way, if our listeners would like to share comments or any suggestions, please send us an email to ms.msinnovationchallenge@roche.com and you will get an answer from me actually. So now let's moving on to the main topic of our episode. And this is, as mentioned, the uncertainty that many people with MS face throughout their lifetimes. Gavin, you have seen so many people with MS in medical practice over the last decades, we have to say. We would like to hear from you, or are wondering if you could explain why uncertainty is something that accompanies so many people with MS, and how can it impact their lives?
When you actually survey people with MS, often the diagnostic consultation is the one that traumatizes them the most. And I did a survey by my social media site, and it's something like 3/4 of MS patients have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or in response to being told they've got MS. So it's life-changing because it has consequences for their life. The kind of questions that people automatically come into their head is, can I find a partner? Should I tell my partner? If I start dating somebody new, when do I tell them I've got MS? Can I go to university? Will it affect my job? Will my income drop? Will I become disabled? Can I have a family? So all these it impacts on all those questions in terms of your projected life course. And then the thing that I find the most difficult, particularly where I work in the United Kingdom, is the public perception of MS is very poor. And the reason for that is the poster child or the poster children of MS tend to be people who got the disease when they're very famous celebrities. They've got the disease when they've been very young and they become very disabled. And the one that everybody thinks about in the UK is Jacqueline du Pré, the famous celloist. She developed MS, I think, when she was about 17 or 18. And, she had to stop playing the cello when she was in her early 30s and died at 42. And so this is the worldview. I'm going to get this disease. I'm going to be very disabled, unable to work, and I'm going to die young. And that's not what happens to MS anymore. The other one is, the Harry Potter writer J.K. Rowling. She always talks about her mom, Anne Rowling, who had MS, and her mother died at 52 from progressive disease. And everybody thinks about how terrible this disease is, but those people lived in the pre-DMT era. So, we have to start changing that perception. So I think this is one of the reasons why it's such a life-changing event and people think the worst, the absolute worst. I just want to say that people always go through the stages of, Helen Kubler-Ross, the American-Israeli psychologist who described the stages of mourning when you there's a similar stage that people with MS go through. They go through this, what I call DABDA. They go through a phase of denial. They often get angry, usually with the healthcare professional. They may bargain and get second, third opinions. Often they get depressed, and then finally they go through this phase called acceptance, where they come to terms with having the disease and they adjust to the disease. Now, one of my patients said to me, we should add another A on there for anxiety. And this is where the fear comes in, the anxiety. I have no idea what's going to happen in the future, and you worry about all the things happening in the future. And I think that's where, I suppose it happens with every chronic disease. If you get diagnosed with a serious cancer, you'll have the same type of concerns. Will I be cured? Will I have a good life? So all the issues that come up with being diagnosed with a serious chronic illness happen to people with multiple sclerosis.
I recently came across a publication about uncertainty in people with MS that was published in November last year in Multiple Sclerosis and Related Disorder. And the study aimed to assess the degree of uncertainty in people with relapsing remitting MS in Spain, actually across 19 sites in Spain. Could you tell us a little bit more about this study? I would be interested to hear more about key findings that stood out to you, and also the key factors that contributed the most to the uncertainty that people with MS faced in this study.
Yeah, so this was a study looking at uncertainty, and as with most social constructs, there's an outcome measure a questionnaire you can complete to measure uncertainty. So they actually looked at one of these uncertainty of illness questionnaires, a scale, and they found that a certain proportion of them were suitable for people with multiple sclerosis. And not surprising, everything I've already discussed, they notice that people with multiple sclerosis do have uncertainty, particularly around the unpredictable nature of MS. When is my next relapse going to happen, for example? The variability of symptoms. What did come up was treatment safety risks, long-term disability, and so all of the issues that I was discussing earlier came up in this cohort. So I think what it does say is that, as expected, multiple sclerosis patients have a lot of uncertainty. This particular study was limited to quite early in the disease, so soon after diagnosis in so-called relapsing patients. I think, to be honest with you, from my own personal experience, this is the group that is the most anxious early on in the disease.
That's interesting.
Because they're new to the disease, they haven't acquired all the knowledge and the understanding of the disease, haven't learned to modulate their responses to the disease. And I think people with more advanced disease, although they do still have uncertainty, they tend to manage it much better. That's just and I also suspect you adapt, so your expectations of what you want out of life and what you expect to do changes with disease duration. So even though they may be more disabled, for example, have more difficulty walking or doing it, that becomes the new norm in inverted commas, and then they adjust their expectations around that, and they live with the uncertainty a lot better. However, in the early stages of the disease, you're fighting it. You're in the denial phase, and it causes anxiety. And this is a big issue with MS: is the anxiety response, the worry. I call it rumination, and I always ask patients in clinic about this because a lot of people spend enormous amounts of time living with the disease or ruminating. They keep thinking about it, so it interrupts their ability to work and it interrupts their ability to sleep because they are constantly asking themselves questions that they can't answer because they don't know. And this is one of the reasons why, if you ask about anxiety, uncertainty, and the rumination syndrome, you can often help patients by recommending certain therapies for them.
Right. And now looking to the future, what are some strategies or concrete action items that we could do really to improve in this regard and to help people with MS to reduce or minimize the level of uncertainty?
Well, I mean, in the UK, Tony Blair, one of our former prime ministers, was famous for saying, his priorities were education, education, education. And I feel the same way about people with MS, is activate the person, make them want to know about their disease, and education, education, education. So the more they know about the disease, the more comfortable they get with self-managing and dealing with the problem themselves. The issue we have is they've got to use reliable resources. So you've got to teach them how to avoid misinformation or disinformation. Like with any disease, there are lots of unscrupulous people out there who want to make a quick buck out of these people and sell them, snake oil cures, etc. So they really do need to use reliable resources, both from the MS charities are quite good at also screening this out, but they also need to know how to filter, particularly information they get off the internet. So I think that's important, is reliable resources. And then they've got to have a good relationship with their medical professionals. They've got to understand that this is a chronic disease, lifelong disease. So they have to find a MS service, a neurologist, MS nurse, whatever, and feel that there's a partnership. You can't be fighting your healthcare professionals. And I think that's really, really important. A lot of the frustration that comes out of, I run this online website called this online newsletter called MS Selfie, and I get lots of we do a lot of question and answer, and some of the comments that get put up there, it's the continual battle with their healthcare professionals about not getting the right information or getting questions answered about the right treatment that is a problem. And the people that have a good relationship with the healthcare professional, I think, do so much better. Then there's obviously psychological and emotional support. So, we often, if people have got a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, we would refer them for counseling. There's different types of levels of counseling that we could start off with talking therapy, essentially. If that doesn't work, they have to go and have a formal course in CBT. And they can go off even further to psychotherapy, for example. So depending on how they do, talking therapy, CBT, and above. What we do recommend is everybody engage with mindfulness. So mindfulness is simply meditation practice. And understanding that what's happened in the past you can't change, the future hasn't happened, so you should focus on the positives, on the now, and try not to ruminate about things that you can't control. And similarly, in addition to that, they could also try yoga exercise with breathing, for example, to deal with their anxiety. This is just common sense. This is not only relevant to people with MS, people outside of the MS, outside of just the general population can do with this. And then I always recommend lifestyle interventions. So people have to start taking control of their lifestyle and try and live a healthy life. We know that certain poor lifestyle factors impact on MS. So it's about exercise, good sleep, good diet. And then also I try and activate them. People with MS need to also realize that they can't be passive recipients of care. They have to be proactive. So it's about learning how to activate yourself and be engaged with self-management. And then people also have to focus on what they can control and set realistic goals. They should also have hobbies and activities outside of, living with their disease. That's sometimes very difficult. I've got some patients, they just spend all day dealing with multiple sclerosis, and that's not good for you. So you've got to try and work into your daily routine other activities that are not just around about MS. And then I suppose the most important thing is social health, is maintaining your social networks. Some people with MS withdraw from society. Maybe they lose their jobs or they resign, feel they can't work. They become socially isolated. They become lonely. And that's really bad for people's mental health. So, can we make sure that they maintain their social connections? I think that's really, really important. There's emerging data from across neurology that reduced social capital, which is basically how we measure the social connections, is a very poor prognostic factor for a lot of diseases. So be proactive about that. We have a really great thing in the NHS. We now have this ability to refer people for social prescribing, and this has got nothing to do with pharmaceuticals or established therapies. It could be referring patients to a gardening club, for example, art classes, book clubs. I don't know if it's the activity that's important. What's really important is those are all social activities, so they meet people. And I think it's those interactions that help. So social prescribing is going to be something in the future. So I think there's lots that can be done. And I think we have to make sure that the MS teams looking after people with multiple sclerosis are aware that their job doesn't just stop at prescribing a disease-modifying therapy or looking after a particular symptom. It's got to go beyond, what I would call MS-specific matters. They've got to manage people with the disease holistically, and that includes social prescribing.
And now, Gavin, I think our listeners will be interested to hear from you what the next main theme of the second series will be.
So this will be about brain health. And this is like a really hot topic. We were talking about it in MS, more than a decade ago. But I think it's become really, really hot, not only because of multiple sclerosis, but for general population health. And the WHO, for example, has got a brain health initiative. Almost all the neurological societies, be it in Europe or the United States, are beginning to focus on brain health. Because we realize now that when you have a brain disease or you're at risk of a brain disease, it's the factors that have impact on the health of the brain that impact on the outcome of those diseases. And I think the analogy area is cardiovascular health. We know now that there's been a big focus on trying to protect your heart, what's good for the heart. All the things are good for the heart. And I think those factors are also good for the brain. So we'll be discussing that across the next series of podcasts. And I think what will be nice about this podcast is not going to be the general stuff that everybody knows about. We will also be discussing the underpinning biology, hopefully give you some evidence-based advice around, for example, diet, exercise, where we have evidence. We'll talk about concepts called metabolic hacking, how you can improve your metabolism. And we'll also be talking about the interaction with aging, because aging is part of, we know that people who have good brain health age better. And so we'll talk about how we target anti-aging as a strategy for improving brain health. So I think it's going to be important. And this particular series of podcasts is not only relevant for people with MS or managing multiple sclerosis. This is about population health. So, everybody should benefit from listening to the series of podcasts. And, as a healthcare professional, unless you're prepared to walk the talk, in other words, try and do what you tell patients to do, it's very difficult to expect those individuals to adopt good behaviors. So this is about behavioral change. And so unless you as a healthcare professional are not prepared to do that yourself, it's very difficult to stand on a pedestal and try and tell people to exercise, sleep better when you're not exercising, and your sleep hygiene is very poor, for example. So I'm excited about this.
And I'm also super excited about the next podcast series, really to learn more together with our speakers and also with our listeners about brain health. And as you mentioned, this second series should be a series where everyone can learn something about brain health. And it doesn't matter if you are healthy or diagnosed with a certain disease. There should be something interesting in the episodes for everyone.
Well, maybe we can actually have one episode on, is aging a disease?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I hope it's not a disease. So I would rather tend to believe healthy aging is part of the process, getting older. But of course, there are pathophysiological mechanisms behind it that we maybe cannot neglect.
Yeah, so I also think it's about incentives. As soon as you define aging as a disease, and you develop therapies for it, then it moves into the healthcare space rather than being outside the healthcare space. So, it creates incentives for drug development, for pharmaceutical companies to actually get reimbursement for products that delay or slow down aging. And so I actually think we as a society should start looking for, and there are ways of defining diseases. It's not like we're sucking this out of our thumb. I mean, there's a standard definition of how you classify something as a disease. And I think aging, or premature aging in particular, ticks the boxes of being a disease. And so therefore we should have therapies for it. And that's an important concept, because we could be adding on those treatments on top of what we use for MS now to improve outcomes. So this is relevant not only to MS, but across the board. Anyway, I've got another question for you, Vera. Yeah, I mean, you've basically become a podcast producer, because this is your baby. And so, how do you feel about that role, considering that you are a clinician and you work for a big pharmaceutical company? How do you feel about becoming a podcast producer?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for asking. I'm enjoying this new role very much, I have to say. And I have also to admit that reading and listening to books and podcasts is really something that I love very much. And I do this every day, actually, since my childhood. So you can imagine when the idea came up in the team, maybe to do a podcast program, that I was the first one in the room who raised the hand and said, oh, I think we should do that. But of course, we also had a really strong rationale to try this new podcast program. Because about 1.5 years ago, we set out this MS Innovation Challenge on how to best manage and maintain your health in MS. And we started communicating about it. And the team and we quickly realized that there was much less awareness of the whole topic than we ever thought. So that's kind of the story. And I'm also a big believer in communication, education that can help us really to improve certain things in the field, and also this kind of seamless collaboration between academia, between clinicians and the industry, and most importantly, the people that are diagnosed with those diseases. Yeah, did this answer your question?
It did, but also I think I should, thank you as a company for investing in this initiative, because I do think it offers a lot more than the traditional communication routes. Written text and going to conferences. And even the conferences, it's very difficult to have a format where healthcare professionals and people with the disease and their families can be together. And at least I think the podcast format addresses both audiences. And it's also informal. And I think that's what I like most about it. There isn't a very strict agenda. We stick to, let people discuss things in general, and we can go off piste. So I really do like the format. So I just want to thank you as a company for investing in this and actually continuing to the second series.
Right. Yeah, I guess this concludes this episode. Then, Gavin, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast program again, and for sharing your perspectives. And to our listeners, thank you for taking the time. And I just wanted to recommend maybe to subscribe to the podcast program, which you can do on YouTube and Spotify, so you don't miss any episode. Until then, stay safe and be curious.